Welcome back to the open ground. Before we begin, I would like to thank all of you who have found my work worthy of subscribing. This means everything. Today I have essayed a special exploration. The human mind, a perpetual engine of signification. This will be the first video in our performative philosophy playlist. Performative philosophy, in this framing, becomes a meta-gesture, not just philosophy about perception, collapse, masculinity, or mind, but philosophy that enacts the very dynamics it interrogates. In this case, the writing performs cognition by demonstrating the mind's filtering, shaping, refracting in real time. It doesn't just analyze the mind, it moves like it, performs fracture by refusing premature synthesis, holding tension instead of resolution, performs confrontation by deliberately rupturing comfort, coherence, and inherited concepts without rushing to restabilize, performs meaning-making by rendering each insight as a temporary constellation, not a claim to totality. Here, and within this playlist, the writing is not a passive description of thought. It is an enactment of the very processes it dissects. It does not speak from above the topic. It becomes it. Oh, and we can't skip this part. Meta-reflection, the mind before the map. We do not begin with collapse. We begin before the structure that could collapse, before the identity that could fracture, before the architecture that could be questioned. This time, we begin with the forger, the one who names collapse before collapse is even recognized. The mind, not the soul, not the spirit. The mind, that architect of coherence, that filter through which all else is rendered into graspable shape. It is not neutral. It is not passive. It builds before we ask it to. It edits before we know what to say. It narrates before we have a voice of our own. This essay does not follow from a previous arc. It does not assume the reader has walked a path through culture, masculinity, identity, or collapse. It does not require that you've wrestled with the aftermath of performance or endured the rituals of re-engagement. It requires only that you think, or rather, that you notice how you think. This is not the mind as a subject. This is the mind as the terrain, the conditions, the soil in which every thought, belief, and perception takes root, whether we notice the soil or not, whether we trust its fertility or question its composition, whether we call its growth clarity or mistake it for truth. Here, we hold no reverence for the mind's coherence. We hold reverence for its audacity, its capacity to shape meaning, to filter experience, to reduce chaos into pattern. And it is precisely that capacity which demands scrutiny. This essay is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of fidelity to that which precedes all betrayal, perception itself. What is examined here is not what the mind sees, but the seeing itself. Not what is known, but what makes knowing possible, and what distortions are baked into that possibility. The question is not merely what do I believe, but how did belief become possible? Not what is real. But what does the mind require in order to call something real? This is not epistemology in the abstract. This is lived philosophy. This is the slow discipline of confronting the mechanisms beneath your certainties. It is not about dismantling thought. It is about witnessing its machinery before it disappears into function. It is about the moment just before naming, the friction between encounter and interpretation. That is the real beginning. What follows is not meant to be digested in one sitting. It is not structured for ease. It is written for those willing to pause, not just to read, but to notice what is reading. You are not being asked to agree. You are being asked to see, to feel the grain of your cognition, to interrogate the architecture of your understanding, not so you might destroy it, but so that for once you might behold its scaffolding in full. Here, the mind is not the background, it is the question. And the question is not, how do we think clearly? The question is, who taught us what counts as clarity in the first place? Ideas, and the instrument that makes ideas possible. Answers, and the impulse to reach for them. And lastly, the mind, not as refuge, not as ruler, but as reveal. We begin. From there, we turn now to the mechanism itself. After the collapse, after re-engagement, after the weight has been examined and the architecture questioned, what remains is the mind, not the soul, not the spirit. The mind, that silent forger of coherence, that whispering cartographer who sketches meaning into the void long before we are conscious of having chosen any map at all. We do not begin here in celebration of it. We begin here because it cannot be bypassed. Because before we act with clarity, we must interrogate the source of what we believe to be clear. Before we engage presence, we must understand the lens through which presence is rendered. This is not epistemology for its own sake. This is ontological necessity. The mind is not merely a processor of reality. It is a translator, a filter, a sculptor, and most dangerously, a convincer. It transforms sensation into story, perception into belief, and experience into narrative. It creates meaning perpetually, not as an act of honesty, but as a survival instinct refined into structure. And in doing so, it offers coherence that may not always be truthful, but feels essential. This is the next site of excavation. Not to destroy the mind, but to reveal its contours, to strip away the assumptions embedded in language, the patterns hardened into cognition, the comfort of conclusion masquerading as understanding. We are not here to master the mind. We are here to see it, to observe it not as a neutral tool, but as an active participant in our misunderstandings. What follows is not instruction, it is confrontation, not judgment, but deliberate unraveling. Let us begin with the mind, not because it is supreme, but because it has shaped everything we believe deserves to be called real. And now, we ask it to account for that power. The mind as mirror, maker, and mistake. The mind does not reflect reality. It reconstitutes it. What we call perception is not the reception of what is, but the construction of what can be endured. It is a perpetual engine of signification, yes, but one that spins meaning from instability. Weaving coherence not because the world is coherent, but because we are terrified it might not be. After collapse, this becomes clear. In the absence of structure, the mind races to build one. It grasps at fragments of memory, impulse, assumption, anything that might approximate stability. But stability built without interrogation is illusion. An illusion, left unchallenged, becomes the architecture of our delusion. The mind does not record, it edits. It does not witness, it narrates. This narration is not neutral. It is shaped by fear, by inheritance, by the momentum of architecture we did not choose. And so, what we call understanding is often just the most coherent lie we can tell ourselves, a map not of what is, but of what we are able to bear. This essay is not about glorifying the mind, it is about confronting it. Not as a temple, but as a tool, not as a source of truth, but as the first site of distortion. Before we re-engage with the world, we must first re-engage with the instrument we use to perceive it. And we must ask, what if the mind is not simply the bridge between self and world, but also the veil between what is and what I name? There is a tension at the core of perception, a space between what is and what I name, between the raw presence of reality and the narrative the mind imposes to render it survivable. I've called this interaction the dance between isness and suchness. The former, the ungraspable essence of what simply exists. The latter, the way that existence becomes particular. textured, knowable, or so I believe. But this dance is not innocent. It is not without distortion. The mind, in its hunger for form, cannot leave isness untouched. It cannot resist converting presence into comprehension. And in doing so, it does not merely interpret. It alters. It imposes boundaries. It renders the ineffable into a name, the unformed into identity, the vast into manageable coherence. Isness, in its purity, resists possession. It is the unconditioned, the part of reality that precedes our frameworks, defies our categories, and remains unmoved by our interpretations. But suchness, what the mind makes of isness, that is where distortion creeps in. We do not see the world as it is, we see the world as our architecture allows. The mind, then, becomes a filter, a prism that both reveals and refracts. It does not betray maliciously, it simplifies out of necessity. But necessity, when unexamined, becomes blindness. To dwell in this space, honestly, is to realize that meaning is never clean. It is always a negotiation between presence and perception, between the weight of what is and the architecture of what the mind permits us to see. And so, I must ask again, am I encountering reality, or only my mind's rendering of it? Have I ever seen a thing without naming it, without positioning it in my inherited lattice of meaning? Have I ever let something be without trying to make something of it? The invention of process, the illusion of continuity. I once believed consciousness to be process, a noble, spiraling movement toward meaning, a continuum of interpretation, synthesis, and becoming. I called it a perpetual engine, not realizing I had already romanticized the machine. But what if this process is not inherent to consciousness, but merely the shape we assign to its chaos? What if we only call it process because we cannot bear the alternative, that there may be no arc, no sequence, no story? That meaning is not an unfolding, but a reflex. The mind, desperate for coherence, invents process where there may only be flashes. It weaves a thread from scattered beads of perception, then forgets that it is the one who threaded them. It cannot abide rupture, so it engineers continuity. This is not evil, it is survival. But survival is not clarity. To say the mind makes meaning is to already forgive it. It presumes intention, sophistication, even nobility. But the mind may do no more than flinch, and call that flinch a philosophy. It may seize a moment, distort it through expectation, frame it with memory, and call the result understanding. Meaning may not be made, it may simply be assigned. And what we call insight may only be the moment when two distortions align long enough to resemble coherence. I am not condemning the mind, I am simply stepping back from its seduction. Its architecture is brilliant, but not neutral. It is a system of defense dressed as discernment. It creates the illusion of forward motion so that I do not look down and realize I am only treading in place. And yet, even in this indictment, I find paradox. For even if meaning is illusion, it is a shared illusion. Even if process is fiction, it is a beautiful one. The mind, in its grasping, becomes both architect and artist. It builds not just understanding, but aesthetic. Not just maps, but music. This, then, is the deeper ambiguity, that even if meaning is false, it still forms me. Even if continuity is a trick, it still sustains me. And if the mind is a liar, it is a liar, whose lies I have loved into the shape of a life. Chaos without consolation. There is a moment in the philosophical life where even coherence feels dishonest. Not because it fails to appear, but because its appearance feels too convenient. I have reached that moment. The thread, once comforting, now feels ornamental. The patterns too symmetrical, the synthesis too eager. Chaos, I now see, is not the backdrop awaiting refinement. It is the field itself. It does not beg to be shaped. It does not concede to will. It does not ask questions, and it offers no dialogue. It simply is, and it is not interested in being understood. For too long, the mind has been taught to meet chaos with architecture, to transform what is feral into something domesticated. But what if chaos is not meant to be resolved? What if it is the mirror that refuses to flatter? The truth that cannot be carried without breaking form. To treat chaos as a precursor to order is to flatten it. It is to assume it only exists to be overcome, framed, or utilized. This is the arrogance of systems, the violence of frameworks. And yet, I still feel its pull, not as enemy, but as origin. I do not wish to escape chaos. I wish to dwell within it, long enough to unlearn the reflex that names it enemy, long enough to stop demanding that it produce something useful. I do not seek coherence now. I seek fidelity. Fidelity to the unspeakable, the asymmetrical, the unstructured real. Not because I enjoy the darkness, but because the light has grown artificial. Because what now parades as clarity feels curated, filtered through the soft focus of language, robbed of its gravity by metaphor. This is not a death of meaning, but a reframing of its terrain. Meaning, if it exists at all, may not sit in coherence, but in the refusal to betray what resists coherence, in honoring the illegible, in saying, even this, even here, especially here, I remain. There is dignity in that, not in understanding, but in presence, not in mapping the chaos, but in ceasing to look away from it. Perception and interpretation, tools or traps. There is something inherently suspect about the ease with which the mind names. It sees, it frames, it narrates. A gesture becomes a meaning. A glance becomes a threat. A silence becomes a conclusion. But what if this is not insight, but projection? Not revelation, but choreography. A pre-written dance performed by a mind terrified of the formless. I do not trust perception. I trust that I am perceiving, but I do not trust what my perception insists upon. Interpretation, too, has become suspect, not because it lacks rigor, but because it rarely admits its origins. We interpret not from clarity, but from injury, not from understanding, but from habit. Every perception arrives pre-wrapped in memory, trauma, bias, and architecture. The object is never only itself. It is seen through the lens of what I needed it to be, or feared it might become. And still, I call it reality. Still I say, I saw, I understood, I know. But knowing is not clean. It is not even close. Perception is not a bridge to truth. It is a mirror curved inward. It reflects not the world, but the self, attempting to make the world bearable. This is not condemnation. It is caution. If the mind is a meaning engine, then it is also a self-deception machine, not malicious, but desperate. Desperate to feel safe. Desperate to stitch continuity between chaos and selfhood. Desperate to reduce the ungraspable into something manageable, livable, nameable. We often speak of lenses as if we can simply change them. But the lens is the self, and the self is not transparent. It is layered, defensive, incomplete. To interpret is to reveal as much about one's orientation as about the world itself. So then, what remains? Not truth, but tension. Not insight, but awareness of the machinery. Not clarity, but the discipline to remain suspicious of one's own interpretations. To let them rise, and then interrogate them. To sit beside perception, not inside it. To ask, again and again, what am I protecting? What am I projecting? What do I refuse to see? This is not paralysis. It is presence, stripped of presumption. Perhaps it is only here, in this uneasy posture between vision and delusion, that anything resembling real awareness can begin. The mind as a relational field, or a fractured compass. I was taught that the self is separate, that there is an inner domain, sovereign and private, and an outer world of objects, events, and others. But this separation has never held. The mind, when honestly examined, is not a sealed chamber. It is porous, reactive, bleeding. It leaks into the world it claims to interpret and absorbs more than it knows how to metabolize. The myth of separation persists because it is comforting. If I am discreet, I can be defended. If I am isolated, I can be perfected. But what if the self is not an entity, but an echo, shaped entirely by what it encounters, never quite stable, never quite whole? Every perception is a point of contact, every interpretation a collision. The mind, in its act of meaning-making, does not remain untouched. It is formed in the same moment that it claims to form reality. There is no neutrality here, no distance, no objectivity. And so I begin to question. If the mind is relational, then what is it relating to? If my sense of self arises through interaction, then every flawed context, every inherited script, every cultural distortion becomes part of my internal architecture. The mind is not merely a field of relation, it is a field of entanglement. And if that is true, then the compass I use to orient myself, to navigate choice, meaning, value, may already be skewed by the very world I seek to understand. This is not a theoretical problem. It is a daily one. The man who believes he is acting from his own center may be performing a role authored by absence. The man who thinks he sees clearly may be responding to wounds he has never acknowledged. The relational field, then, is not pure. It is cluttered. It is noisy. It is burdened with ghosts. To trust the mind is to misunderstand its function. It does not seek truth. It seeks coherence. And coherence can be fabricated, as long as it feels consistent with the inherited self. But here, I no longer want consistency. I want fracture. Not for its own sake, but as the only honest condition for reorientation. The compass must be broken before it can be recalibrated. If the mind is relational, then the work is not to master it, but to purify the field, not through erasure, but through confrontation. To trace the echo back to its origin, to map the distortions, to ask, who am I when I no longer perform what was expected of me? In this light, the self becomes not a thing, but a process of becoming within a field of competing signals. The question is not, what do I believe? But, what voices built this belief? Not, who am I? But, whose architecture am I still living inside? Presence is possible, but not until the compass is questioned. Not until the field is cleared of false echoes. Not until the mind admits that it is not its own beginning. Only the place where meaning temporarily converges before unraveling again. The perpetual fracture. Why understanding must remain incomplete. We are taught to equate understanding with closure. To arrive at clarity is to rest, to speak with finality, to claim ownership of the known. But every time I have neared such a moment, I have felt it slip. Not because I lacked intelligence, but because I mistook coherence for truth. The mind craves pattern. It seeks it compulsively, desperately. And so it builds understanding like a fortress. Walls of logic, gates of language, towers of reinforced belief. But beneath every wall is a fracture, and beneath every belief. A question that was buried before it could destabilize the frame. This is not failure, it is function. The mind is not an organ of mastery, it is an aperture. A lens shaped by perspective, distortion, fear, and necessity. What it reveals is never the whole, only the sliver that its present shape allows. I cannot trust a wholeness that arrives too soon. If it does not tremble with contradiction, it has not yet touched the real. If it does not echo with uncertainty, it is still performing. Understanding that claims to be whole is understanding that has stopped growing. And so I name the fracture not as defect, but as compass. The point of breakage becomes the point of entry. It is there, where coherence fails, where belief buckles, that I find the path toward a deeper honesty. The fracture protects me from the arrogance of finality. It reminds me that what I know is never all there is, that insight, too, can become dogma, that even wisdom must be examined for performance. This is the perpetual condition, to stand inside partial understanding, not as a limitation, but as a discipline, not to fear the unknown, but to hold space for it, not as mystery to be solved, but as presence to be honored. It is tempting to seek clarity as comfort, to gather answers like armor, but comfort without confrontation is sedation, and answers that arrive too easily often mask the real questions, the ones that require silence, rupture, excavation. The deeper I go, the less I trust easy fluency. The more refined the language, the more cautious I become. Complexity is not always depth. Sometimes it is disguise, but so is simplicity. The only measure that remains is whether the structure can hold tension without collapse. And so I let the fracture remain. I let it guide my inquiries, temper my convictions, rupture my false coherence. I build, then break, then build again, not in pursuit of permanence, but in pursuit of presence. Understanding must remain incomplete, not because the whole is unreachable, but because wholeness is not the point. The point is participation. The point is staying in motion, in question, in disciplined proximity to what cannot be simplified. To stand inside the fracture and not flee, that is the beginning of wisdom. The desire to understand is not neutral. It emerges from discomfort, from the strain of uncertainty, the hunger for coherence, the instinct to bind loose threads into something graspable. The mind, in its restless activity, pursues understanding as if it were a destination. But what if understanding is not a place we arrive, but a fracture we are meant to remain within? Every conclusion I've ever drawn has, over time, eroded, sometimes gently, through quiet contradiction, sometimes violently, through the shattering force of experience. I used to call this growth. Now I call it something else. The recognition that the mind is not a vessel for truth, but a surface where tension accumulates. We speak of epiphanies as if they are peaks, moments of clarity rising above the fog of confusion. But even these dissolve. They are not mountaintops, but temporary platforms. They give us height, not home. The mistake is believing we are meant to stay there. I have come to see the mind not as a tool for resolving the world, but as a chamber in which the unresolved reverberates. It is the space where contradiction lives, where clarity and uncertainty circle one another without ever collapsing into finality. This is not dysfunction. It is fidelity to the nature of existence. There is a difference between complexity and confusion. Confusion resists structure. Complexity defies closure. What we often name confusion is in fact the discomfort of complexity, the refusal of the world to be explained, categorized, or mastered without remainder. To live perpetually fractured without demanding resolution, this is not weakness, it is presence. It is the man who sees that each moment of understanding is a lens, not a law, that every frame excludes what it does not name. That language can illuminate, but it always leaves something in shadow. The mind is conditioned to avoid this. It builds systems, it reaches for universals. But all systems simplify, all universals reduce. They sacrifice nuance on the altar of certainty, and in doing so, distort the very thing they claim to reveal. The philosopher who seeks totality betrays the very task of philosophy. The man who demands a final frame for life has already begun to die inside it. The pursuit of understanding must remain provisional, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Reverence for what cannot be captured, for what exceeds language, for the mystery that does not collapse under scrutiny, but expands. The mind, at its best, does not dominate this mystery. It dances with it, briefly, imperfectly, then bows and steps back. This is the shift I offer. Do not seek closure. Seek clarity within fracture. Seek the discipline to remain where the threads don't tie neatly, where the questions keep asking back. Not to linger in indecision, but to sharpen intention without flattening reality. The perpetual fracture is not failure, it is fidelity. It is the mark of a man who has seen that understanding is not what ends the inquiry, it is what deepens it. The inherent tension, chaos, and coherence. The mind's perpetual impulse to find meaning does not emerge from serenity but from the turbulent interaction between chaos and coherence. A tension not to be solved, but to be held. Chaos, as I see it now, is not a flaw in the system of understanding. It is the system's engine. It is the unfiltered, unstructured totality of experience, brimming with unpredictability, novelty, and contradiction. Coherence is not its antidote, but its relational counterpart. The act of arrangement, the formation of temporary constellations that allow us to move, to speak, to choose. Meaning is not found in eliminating chaos, it is forged within the encounter. What we often call understanding is not the vanquishing of the unknown, but the construction of a frame through which the unknown can be engaged without disintegration. The mind does not seek safety, not truly, it seeks participation. And participation demands that we remain porous to incoherence while still tracing coherence as a navigational act. In this way, chaos is not overcome, but translated, given temporary form without being reduced to simplicity. This is what allows presence to emerge, the ability to remain near what threatens to unmake us, and to respond with form that does not collapse under its own certainty. This does not happen by accident. The capacity to extract coherence without betrayal of complexity requires discipline, not intellectual control, but ontological humility. It means refusing the temptation to oversimplify. It means allowing contradictions to coexist long enough for something more nuanced to be born. Here, coherence is no longer defined as clarity alone, but as the tensioned awareness of all that cannot be reconciled but must still be carried. I've found that this form of coherence has more in common with jazz than mathematics. It is improvisational, contingent, responsive. It demands that we remain attentive to rhythm, to dissonance, to silence. The mind becomes a kind of instrument, not producing answers, but attuning itself to the resonance of meaning within disorder. Each moment, then, is not a solved equation, but a held note. Temporary, incomplete, but sufficient for continuation. This tension is not a philosophical abstraction. It is the shape of human life. Every man lives within the tension of ideals unmet, responsibilities unclear, desires misaligned. The danger lies not in the presence of these tensions, but in the refusal to hold them, in the rush to resolve prematurely, to impose coherence where none yet belongs. To live meaningfully is to accept that coherence, too, must be earned, not through control, but through sustained engagement with the unresolved. And so we return to the truth that the mind is not a refuge from chaos. It is the crucible where chaos is made speakable. And in that speaking, tentative, trembling, and incomplete, we find the beginnings of a coherence that does not erase the unknown, but walks beside it. This is not mastery, this is maturity. A momentary pause. Let us not confuse stillness with certainty. This pause is not the settling of dust after truth has landed. It is the suspension that comes when the work of naming has finally exhausted its dominion, when language, having circled the structure of the mind long enough, must fall quiet, not out of failure, but out of reverence. We have not arrived. We have only circled closer to the edge where arrival becomes irrelevant. where the need to grasp gives way to the capacity to dwell. There is no bow to tie, only this: the awareness that even our finest insights shimmer with approximation, that even the most refined articulation is a shadow of what stirs beneath articulation. The fracture we have traced is not a wound to be healed, but a space to be held, not so that we might close it, but so we might stop fleeing from what it reveals. This is the invitation: to remain within the trembling, to let the tools of perception be seen as shaped and shaping, to let coherence remain provisional, to allow presence to be enough, not as solution, but as stance. And if this pause holds any wisdom at all, it is this: that the mind, beautiful and broken, cannot be bypassed, but it can be witnessed. And through that witnessing, we may begin not to master, but to meet ourselves again without disguise. Let this be not the end, but a clearing. Let the fracture remain. Let the silence answer nothing. And let that be, finally, enough. What did this leave you with? Tell me in the comments below. Until next time.